Welcome back to Hilaal TV. Of course, the special broadcast of South Africa at The Hague. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us. A really historic day as South Africans, and I think encapsulated by what was spoken by our legal representatives down at The Hague at the ICJ. And of course, first I'd like to thank my colleague Lukman Shadrack for taking you through from 5 to 6. And of course, before that, my colleague Khawa Solomon, along with Sheikh Riyad Walls. Now, we always often speak about, history and how history can be made. And I feel that today South Africa really created that. South Africa has instilled a sense of patriotism. We speak of patriotism, of course, last year's Rugby World Cup, even part the Cricket World Cup, even though we got locked out in the semi-finals. But it really was a day to be proudly South African. Now, for me personally, this is a proud moment when I'm introducing my next guest, because when I started university, I'm not going to give the year, when I walked into my first ever politics lecture class, and it was a very early morning, I had this distinguished gentleman, of course, giving that first lecture at the University of Johannesburg. And it really is such a proud moment to have him here with us in studio. I'd like to welcome Professor Farid Essack, who of course serves as a board member also for Africa for Palestine. Prof, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah so much for joining us.
Salam. It's a pleasure being with you and your viewers.
Prof, what a day of patriotism. What a day to be South African. I mean, I'm just seeing all over social media that outpouring of patriotism. I know we've seen this during various sports events. Prof, you probably remember 1994, when Nelson Mandela was inaugurated, or even when the elections happened in that year. But today just felt something else, didn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Our country is doing us proud. Our country is doing us proud. I think that all of its inadequacies, all the difficulties that we face in our day-to-day lives, we're living in an amazing country. A country that you are free. You're free to be a Muslim, any kind of Muslim that you want to be. You're free to be an ardent human rights supporter, whatever the area of human rights you are in. You can speak and you can expect the government to be in your corner in a vast array of international issues. You can go to the streets and I'm not necessarily one of them, but you can go to the streets and proclaim your support for Hamas, and nobody is going to come and knock on your door in the middle of the night. So South Africa today, more than in a long time, South Africa as a country has done us proud. But not just for us as South Africans. South Africa, the global South, the people in Latin America, in the rest of Africa, in the Middle East, we've done the weakest of them, we've done them proud. Their own governments haven't had the courage to stand up. Their own governments are too desperate to ingratiate themselves with the United States and other powers in the world. So they prefer to take a glance away. And so in the middle of all of this country, that's not an enormously powerful country, by the way. This country takes the moral high ground and say, we will stick it to you. We will stand up. And so in some ways, it's like, so South Africa, in theory, has a conflict with Israel. And this is what, in some ways, the case is about. South Africa's conflict with Israel. And in theory, it's like an insignificant conflict. South Africa has this opinion, and Israel has this opinion. South Africa has written to Israel and told them this is what, and Israel has written back and says, no, we don't agree. And so this is in theory, the conflict. But of course, the conflict represents something far bigger. The biggest genocide that we have seen, and the scale of it, and of course the horror of it, is the intentionality. People don't announce, I'm going to commit genocide. People do it, and afterwards they make excuses. In Israel's case, the question of intentionality looms large. And then this country takes up this larger-than-life role in the world and stands up. It's like a David, really knocking, punching way above its weight, but really knocking Goliath. And of course, in the next while, we'll see, how well the shot was aimed and to what extent it put Firaun down. And that we'll discuss in the course of our discussion. But yes, South Africa has done the world proud. It embarrassed a significant part of the world, the powerful, the United States, countries like the UK, they don't quite know what to do. And just by the way, the UK is one of the only Security Council members that has its own domestic law tied in. They are under obligation to follow the injunctions of the International Criminal Court. All the other four big powers, they say, we obey the court, but we're not going to pay attention to what the court says. But anyway, yes, it's been a tremendously proud day for us as South Africans.
Prof. Essack, when you saw, obviously, Senior Advocate Adela Hasif come to the stage as a Muslim, I mean, that felt, a Muslim and she's female, that felt even more significant. But our legal team, I mean, when this was announced, obviously just after, Christmas Day, you felt that South Africa is taking that moral high ground. And you've mentioned it, we have our challenges in this country, the load sheddings, the corruptions, the lack of service delivery. But I think today we put that aside because we paid special attention to, that legal team. And, I saw a tweet and it compared them to the Springboks or, any one of the sporting teams that do us proud or any of the athletes that do us proud. And really you felt there that South Africa has taken not just the moral high ground, but the highest stage in such a global body.
Absolutely, so the team is led by this, Adila's not actually exactly young, but relatively young, Muslim South African woman, exceptionally articulate. She came up there, and with all this confidence faced the judges, and knowing that the whole world was focused on her, she did a brilliant kind of opening batting for the rest of the South African team. But also the combination of the team, again, very senior people, but relatively young, many of them. But then, so it's not only the South Africans, you had an Afrikaner guy, you had a black South African guy from the Eastern Cape, then you had Adila, who's also a senior counsel, and then you have John Dugard, who has served as an ad hoc judge on the court himself, one of the leading international law scholars in the world. And then what was fascinating, and then there was a young, Afrikaner guy from KwaZulu-Natal, Du Plessis.
Max Du Plessis, yes.
So, and then, to have them accompanied by some really huge giants in the international law scene, Vaughan Lowe from the UK King's Council, who's also been an ad hoc judge many times, one of the great international scholars of genocide. So South Africa just put together an absolutely brilliant team. Now, of course, as far as Dikgang Moseneke is concerned, in some ways, he was nominated by South Africa to serve as an ad hoc judge. The International Court of Justice do allow for two countries that are in dispute to each appoint an ad hoc judge. So they complement the 15 other judges who are permanent judges on the court. So, of course, I mean, the Kgang Moseneke, while he is a South African appointee, he is theoretically independent.
Yes.
And of course, Israel, of course, also has a judge, Barak, who was their former Chief Justice. And so, yeah, we'll see how that pans out. But South Africa had an absolutely brilliant team. They argued cogently. They stuck to their briefs, and they all complemented each other in an absolute brilliant way. Of course, it's very difficult, you know, to actually read people's body language inside the court. But despite that, I think that the discomfort of the Israeli representatives and panelists who we will hear from more tomorrow, that it was quite visible. They had a hard time, I think, trying to remain as stoic and kind of, you know, not blinded by any of these things.
One had the head, one had his head on his head, so
yes,
they look bewildered. Yeah.
Yes, but they are in for a hard time tomorrow. Of course, all these South African arguments, it actually, in some form or another, it appeared in the written documents that was submitted.
Yes.
But to be hearing them, and in some of these South African presentations, accompanied by images that we've never seen, the celebration of death, the celebration of genocide by the Israeli soldiers. Some of that footage was quite new. It hadn't done the rounds on social media yet. So yes, I mean, it was a day on which South Africans, and as I said before, the international community have much to be proud of.
Prof, let's talk about, obviously, these courts.
Yes.
And I think it's important that, you know, even for the layman out there who may not understand the difference between the ICJ and the ICC.
Yes.
Can you maybe just break it down for us? Because I think it's important that, you know, one realizes that there is one that supersedes each other. Can you maybe expand on that,
okay.
please? Yeah.
So the International Court of Justice, it has been around from the time of the League of Nations already, before the establishment of the United Nations itself. And of course, like many of the other functions of the League of Nations, it was taken over by the United Nations. So the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, that is it's an inherent part of the United Nations system. So it's an organic part of the United Nations system. It is the highest legal body of the United Nations. And the biggest difference is this, that both in who it is accountable to essentially, it is accountable to the United Nations, and this is where the sting in the tail is, to, in some ways, the General Assembly, but in some ways, the Security Council. But the International Court of Justice is primarily a place where countries and states complain against each other. And there's a variety of kinds of complaints. It can be border disputes, it can be fishing rights disputes, it could be questions of different kinds of disputes that countries have with each other. And so some of the cases in the International Court of Justice can be quite banal. It can be quite, you know, just a country fighting over a piece of sea, how far fishing rights is, and so on goes. But it also has had some significant legal matters that affect human rights. In the early 70s or in the late 60s, there was the International Court of Justice's, there was a complaint by the United Nations against South Africa for South Africa's occupation against of Namibia. Yes. And there the court gave a judgment against South Africa and demanded that South Africa leaves Namibia. Okay, and then about 10 years ago, there was an advisory opinion that the court gave, that the apartheid wall in Israel is an illegal construction. But the International Court of Justice, so largely officiates between countries. Individuals don't have the right to lay complaints with the International Court. It is one country facing another country. That is the huge difference between this. And the second thing is that the International Court of Justice is an intrinsic part of the United Nations' mechanisms. The International Court of Justice it has no appeal process to it. You can't appeal. Their judgments are final. There's no review of their judgments, and that's it.
Prof, in this way I want to
Yes.
come in. So, for example, and I think many, would see this as probably a really shining light of international law should it go through. If the International Court of Justice finds that Israel is guilty of genocide, that's it. The order is given.
That's correct.
Yes.
There's no appeal.
Yes.
The problem, though, so on the one hand, I mean, it has huge moral stature and public relations stature. You don't get indicted by another court or another entity and have as much dirt on your face as happens when the International Court of Justice has thrown the crime at you and smothered you with the dirt of culpability. The one difficulty, though, is the question of compliance. There is no ways that the International Court of Justice, or better known as the World Court, there's no ways that the World Court has to enforce its judgments. So the World Court, if a country does not implement it, it can only refer matters to the Security Council.
Right.
And the Security Council, the problem there is that there are 5 of the so-called big powers, that's Britain, France, Russia, China,
yeah.
and the United States. So these 5 countries have a veto right over decisions taken by the Security Council. And so the United States, of course, can always be depended on to support Israel, regardless of whether it's Republicans or Democrats. And that's where the sting is. So the court doesn't have enforcing powers. So, of course, you can ask, so what's the point of all of this if the court can't enforce it?
Yes.
Well, I think that regardless of how barbaric a country may be, they're still desperate for some kind of recognition.
Yes.
And it is this recognition that will be denied to Israel's crimes when the court will find Israel guilty of genocide.
Prof. Essack, you then, of course, brought up that there could also be individual charges against individual leaders. So that is where, of course, the ICC comes in. So, for example, if you have, we're going to take Vladimir Putin as a classic example of this. He was, of course, handed a war crime charge for alleged kidnapping of Ukrainian children. Can there be a separate lawsuit towards Benjamin Netanyahu for, of course, him being the leader of Israel and overseeing what is currently happening in Palestine with regards to the mass murder of civilians in Gaza?
Absolutely, absolutely. So Benjamin Netanyahu is also an individual. He's not just a prime minister of a country, okay? So he's also an individual. So individuals and individual generals, say in the Israeli army, or soldiers that are found guilty or that can be indicted, yes. So the International Criminal Court can move against them. South Africa has, in fact, filed a motion with the International Criminal Court. And without trying to be too technical, the International Criminal Court is the result of you sign on to the International Criminal Court. In the United Nations, with the International Court of Justice, by virtue of your membership of the UN, you are a state that then has to you can be compelled to have your cases heard or respond to a case inside the UN. The International Criminal Court, on the other hand, is a court of different signatories in the world. For example, the US has never signed on to the International Criminal Court. There are a number of other international countries who haven't signed on to it, and they have no membership in it at all. And so the ICC, the International Criminal Court, they can deal with personal, not when I say, I mean as individual,
yes,
but they can deal with individuals. The one problem on the question of Israel with the International Criminal Court is that the International Criminal Court has moved very, very slowly on it. And man, I don't want to kind of go in where I kind of just take digs at courts or at prosecutors. But the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, who's also a British Muslim, by the way, or let me just say he's a British Muslim, okay, fine. Yes, he's been extremely slow. He has been to Israel several times. The Muslim religious community that he comes from has a significant base inside Israel, on the edges of Tel Aviv. And that community, man, has been very supportive of the Israeli regime.
Wow.
That has been very, very supportive of the Israeli regime. And I don't want to say that religion must impact on how prosecutors also must view a particular case. But he's certainly somebody that I wouldn't be proud of at all.
Yes.
And he has been extremely slow after his visits to Israel and so on. And something that apologists for international crimes against humanity, that they always, oh no, both sides have these things to be told and so on.
Yes.
And that's generally been his language.
Yes.
So, man, I don't have much faith in the International Criminal Court, certainly not the prosecutor. And it was an absolutely brilliant move on South Africa's part to have gone to the International Court of Justice, while the ICC, it's taking its own time in even starting an investigation into the case.
Prof, before we go to the break, of course, when Vladimir Putin was given that war crime charges, Omar al-Bashir is another classic example of that. Now, Omar al-Bashir came here to South Africa. We didn't act on those war crime charges. Vladimir Putin didn't, of course, arrive last year at BRICS. Should, of course, the ICJ hand down their judgment against Israel for genocide, if any of their current cabinet were to travel across the world and wherever they visit are signatories to the Rome Statute or the Geneva Convention, is that country where that certain cabinet minister going to visit, are they compelled to arrest them? That's what I want to get to.
If the other country that the alleged criminal is visiting, if that country is also a signatory to the International Criminal Court statute, yes, it is then an obligation.
Right.
And in South Africa's case, again, man, our courts did give a judgment against the government on the question of the Omar al-Bashir thing.
Yes.
But it may not have done the best thing, but South Africa made sure that that guy left the country in the middle of the night before the next day, before the hearing happens.
Yes.
So there is at least some shame. And again, with Putin's coming, South Africa did a brilliant job.
Yeah.
And Putin also did that. Look, I'm not going to go there, you know.
Yeah.
So in many ways, South Africa demonstrates that it is a country where it respects the law. Whether they always like the law or they don't like the law.
Yeah.
But it is a country of laws.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Professor Farid Essack. We're going to be breaking down, of course, what had happened today at the ICJ with regards to South Africa's arguments. Do stay tuned to South Africa at The Hague, a special live broadcast here on Hilaal TV. welcome back to South Africa at The Hague. It's a special broadcast here on Hilaal TV, channel 347 on DSTV. I'm with Professor Farid Essack, who is a board member for Africa for Palestine. Prof. Essack, let's start off, of course, and I want to like to break down each and every legal representative's arguments. Let's start, of course, with Senior Advocate Adila Hassim, where she spoke about genocidal acts. And she broke it down nicely that it's clear that Israel is willing to do it. They're cutting off every basic human right available to the people of Gaza. That in itself already speaks of genocide.
Well, the one is, the violation of different rights.
Yes.
So the violation of different rights doesn't constitute a genocide by its own.
Yes.
When it is evident, the one is evident and the other one is intentionality. When it is evident, when it is clear that, hey, man, everybody can see that you're going for a whole people. You're not going for a criminal in that crowd. You're going for a whole people. And you put all the different violations together that you're doing in this attack on a whole people, then evidentially it becomes genocide. Then there's a completely other dimension to it. The one is intentionality. And for intentionality, I have the intention to do it.
Yes.
You don't even have to prove that genocide has really happened. I say that I want to annihilate a people. And I'm not just a madman on the street. I'm an influential influencer. I'm a cabinet minister. I'm a commander of an army, and I announce my intentions. And of course, it gets worse and worse. It starts right at the top, where the president of Israel, Herzog, wherein he announces the state's intention to wipe off the Gazans from the earth. And then you hear this message being reinforced specifically by the prime minister, and then different ministers in the cabinet, and then the head of the defense force or the army, and then you see this playing out in what soldiers are doing and saying. So the one is, yeah, I'm sorry, I killed this guy, but I really didn't intend it. Or the Oscar Pistorius thing, where I thought that there was an intruder behind the door, and. But no, the one is you announce you are behind the door, you with your whole family. But I've accused you of something, and now I will put bombs into the whole house that will demolish you and your family. So it's like, Oscar Pistorius multiplied multifold times. And so the genocide case was laid out in a brilliant overviewish way by senior counsel Adila Hassan in the first presentation of the court. And so it was an excellent, a brilliant introduction to South Africa's case that began to lay the basis for its further development by the other South African legal representatives.
Let's go to Advocate Ngugai Tobi.
Yes.
And, he during his presentation, he brings videos of the IDF soldiers celebrating the deaths of Gazans. He shows these videos, of course, of Benjamin Netanyahu quoting a holy scripture where they are the God-given right over the land. And then, of course, you mentioned the head of the Israeli Defense Force, quoting human animals. And he said, those three videos, that is so much of evidence right over there suggesting the intent of genocide. And the intent is right there.
But he also broke down neatly the different tiers of government and how they were all complicit in it. And so some of the video snippets that he showed dealt with the precedent. And when it wasn't visual images, it was written images that appeared on the screen. So from the precedent right down. And of course, I mean, I was about to say the classic, but that classic is normally used in a positive way. But the horrific statement made by Netanyahu that the Palestinians are what one of the Old Testament books describe as the Amalek,
Yes.
a tribe, that has to be annihilated. So here Netanyahu comes on the one hand. He's not a religious Jew, by the way, but anything we'll throw in the when we are busy with our genocide intent. So he comes in with this biblical reference to the Amalek, okay, which is an indication, an order to the people of Israel that they have to destroy the Amalek.
Yes.
And now, of course, the Palestinians become synonymous with Amalek. And then the other footage that Advocate Temba, to my embarrassment, I have difficulty pronouncing his
Toby, yes.
to pronouncing his surname. Then he comes and he shows this script, this video that we haven't seen before, of soldiers singing songs about not just the destruction of Amalek, but the seed of Amalek.
Yes.
So here they were signaling that it isn't just Hamas, it isn't just the people of Gaza, but their seeds. And so here is where the criminalization of babies come in, and the criminalization of unborn babies, because you not only have to destroy Amalek, but you have to destroy the seed of Amalek. And this then, to draw the attention of the court to the statements of other ministers who said that not a single living entity must be left roaming the land of Gaza. And so, in some ways, one wants to describe it as brilliant, but brilliant has something affirming to it. But in this very cogent and an excellent presentation, he laid to bear, the huge gap that there has emerged between the rest of humankind and the Israelis as a political and military force. So yes.
Prof. Essack, John Dugard,
Yes.
Professor John Dugard, I mean, you've spoken just about his experience
Yes.
and what he represents in international law, and he spoke of jurisdiction. And he gave such a compelling statement, didn't he? And when you hear somebody of his stature speak, I mean, it really is, for somebody who did not study law like myself, you get attached to it because the wisdom in what he said was so compelling, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And John Dugard, of course, has served as a former ad hoc judge also on the court. And he happens to live also in The Hague, by the way, although he is a South African citizen. John Dugard, as an international scholar, his works are classic textbooks in international law and more particularly on genocide. So many of the judges, well, all the judges on the court would have been familiar, with John Dugard and his works. It's like, you are here, this young advocate, and I was a student of that guy, and he's now. So, of course, John is not, Professor Dugard isn't getting any younger, okay? But he remains one of those very serious scholars that you just have to take seriously. And he did a brilliant, these things, and his domain was the question of jurisdiction, on whether the court had the right to intervene in this. Now, generally, one of the first stages of law is the eligibility of the court to listen to this. Are you guys really entitled to? And so John was arguing that case because it is something that the Israelis will have a first go at when they appear tomorrow on whether the court has jurisdiction on hearing this case. And of course, they're going to lose the case, you know, but it is something that the court will decide on very quickly, and then we'll move on to other stages that we can talk about.
And we will be touching on, of course, you know, what Israel could bring to the table. Yes. I want to bring in Advocate Max du Plessis, who was from KwaZulu-Natal, and he brought, of course, the rights and the protection of rights. And it's clear that any international human law, any human rights that the people of Gaza have has been eroded. And we saw that clearly. And he mentioned, of course, the fact that there's no healthcare. Healthcare workers are to the bone. The fact that there is no aid coming. Here on Hilaal TV, we speak a lot to, you know, various aid agencies, you know, the likes of African Muslims Agency and Islamic Relief, and they struggle because the Israelis have set conditions on how aid needs to be given, or no aid at all. And that's the argument that he put out, the fact that the basic human rights are being clearly denied for the people of Gaza, and it is the Israeli occupation forces that are causing that to happen.
Well, I mean, one of the brilliant things that he did, he put the different cogs of the wheel into place. The different impacts of the Israeli, not just the Israeli occupation, he did allude to that also. And by the way, he was also the one person who also made mention of the number of other countries and international entities that have joined South Africa, either formally or issued declarations in support of South Africa's complaint to the International Court of Justice. So yes, he put all these different violations, he brought them down to a kind of a very basic level about the trucks going in, about the hospital access, about the deaths that are still occurring, the inability of people to access the rubble, and very importantly, telling the Palestinians that they must flee here. And when the Palestinians do, then they bomb there. So he did a brilliant of spinning all of that together to then present an overall evidentiary account, unlike, say, what Temba did or what Duga did, was, you know, to speak to the question of intent. He then spun it all together into a comprehensive account of the evidence of different of how the different genocidal acts were linking together to give the overall clear depiction or image that this is a genocide happening in front of all of us.
Now, there is, of course, wasn't just South African lawyers, of course, there was a lawyer representative from Ireland, Advocate Blind Niclaray,
yes.
Of course, coming from the King's Council. And she, of course, argued the urgency and irreparable harm. And it's clear that the harm being caused to the people of Gaza is there for all to see. You see it in the videos. And it's not just obviously on social media, you see it on the commercial television stations. And I think, you know, Al Jazeera being one of those stations that really goes deep into these refugee camps which the people of Gaza have been forced into. And it shows that, you know, there is no turning back for them, that they have really been taken away from everything that they knew, which was their home of Gaza.
Yes. Actually, you know, she's one of the brightest legal minds in Ireland. And it was a brilliant choice on South Africa's part to have her as a part of the team. So, yes, she spoke to the question of the court's jurisdiction, but also she was beginning to preempt, and this came up later. I mean, she was moving as an introduction also to the King's Counsel, Vaughan Lowe, yes, who spoke after her, beginning to preempt the kinds of arguments that the Israelis would want to come up with or when they do present their case tomorrow. But just drawing attention to the not only the culpability of Israel, but the consciousness of it and how the different layers of the Israeli establishment, from the army to the civil society, to the soldiers, how they've all there's coordination amongst all of them, and it is done in the name of a war on Hamas, but the effect of it is very, very different. So she began to lay the stage, I think. She began to lay to place the setting for the larger argument that came from Vaughan in the end.
Yes.
And this is that the distinction between, say, Hamas is not an entity that, it's not a state actor, it's not a, you can deal with Hamas at another forum if you want to. And so she was absolutely brilliant in the way in which she presented the case, particularly moving on to the idea that even if Hamas did this and that, no matter what a state does in response to anything that is done to the state, no state is entitled to engage in the crime of genocide. So we're not saying what Hamas did is right or what. No. Any state that does what Israel does is guilty of genocide. And genocide is never an acceptable response for a state. So she began to lay the foundations for that case. And of course, I mean, the court has two languages. It has English as a language and it has French as a language. So the one kind of funny thing is that she apologized to the court for the fact that South Africa's case until she spoke, was entirely in English.
Oh, wow.
And then she commenced her case in French.
Yes.
And anyway, so that was just a bit of an aside.
Yeah, I think, just to bring something different, of course, what the proceedings today. And then, of course, we talk of cherry on the top. Von Lowe comes in and just really summarizes everything. And, of course, being part of King's Council, he brings so much of experience with regards to that.
Man, and of course, you had these people in the, and all these, the British barristers and British judges, they have this, they wear these wigs. And just by the way, the person who's leading the Israeli team, the former Chief Justice of Israel, he's also wearing one of these. So probably they were articled or they were barristers in the UK at some stage or the other. And so here this guy comes, and just by the way, he's also been an ad hoc judge a number of times on the court. And here he comes and he just lays, I mean, just as one thought, that the South African case can't be made any better. This guy comes in and very, very eloquently diffuses arguments that he anticipates that the Israelis will make tomorrow. And this is the viciousness of the Hamas attack, when Israel was sleeping and the Israeli government was living in peace with the Palestinians, when out of nowhere came these crazy weirdos in the early hours of October the 7th, and just a bunch of mad people. They inflicted this on Israel. How could Israel not? So he diffused all of those arguments by simply arguing that, and by the way, before that he laid a number of separate arguments, and then he would make this, and then says, no, regardless of that, more important is this. And then the most important, this thing that, of course, that he comes with in the end, it's not even a question of proportionality in war. Where you say, this biblical and even Quranic principle, an eye for an eye, or a, quote unquote, revenge. Wait, by now, 20 23,000 people.
Could be even more. Prof.
Absolutely, and the vast majority of children. Of course, and at some levels, people will say, "Yeah, but the women and the children, the poor women and the children, and so on." Well, in this case, it is intentional. And so he spun all of this together and then laid out the case that, look, we're not saying that what the Israelis went through, that it is inconsequential. But regardless, no human being or state has the right to resort to the destruction of an entire people. And so he kind of wound up the case for South Africa, and then right towards the end, now the World Court has this entity called the agent.
Yes.
And the agent is a person who is based in The Hague,
Yes.
and who is the attorney, so to say. The attorney doesn't argue normally, but is the attorney that handles the case, and then you have got senior counsel and so on. So he then rounded up by just summarizing what South Africa asks of the World Court in terms of immediate relief. And we can come back to this, in a moment, on the question of what are the stages of the World's Court, So what is this now? Are they going to come out against Israel? What does this really mean? The different stages and so on. And so then he wrapped up, what is the immediate relief that South Africa seeks from the World Court?
And Prof, we've just got about 5 minutes.
And he was a South African ambassador, by the way, to the to The Hague.
So I think it really was, a beautiful team.
Yes.
I would like to call it the dream team that South
Yes.
Africa had then. Prof, we've got just under 5 minutes. Israel, their arguments are up next.
Yes.
What happens now? Do they even have anything? What are they going to be? They may be scratching their heads right now thinking, oh, you know what? We've been knocked out by one of those Muhammad Ali robo-dopes. What next?
Yes. Look, Israel will come and play a very, very old card, and that is the card of victimhood. We are the victims.
Yes.
We've always been the victims. We've been the victims for the last 3-4 centuries, not 3-4, since, the beginning of the emergence of the Jewish people. We've always been the victims, and this is... So they will play that card, essentially, and then they will try to focus on the horrors of October the 7th, and they will speak about, the pain of the hostages and so on. They may even come up with some video images and so on. But Israel will try to focus on the horrific nature of October the 7th. And how they're going to get out of the question of genocide, because the court isn't here to decide on October the 7th.
Yes.
And the court will not decide on that. But the court will... So how are they going to get out of the question of genocide? That heaven alone knows. But the Israelis, as far as I can see it, they have little escape hatches, but it'll still be interesting. They have one King's Council member of their defense team. It is headed by the former Chief Justice of Israel, a bit of a liberal character inside Israel himself, but it's all very relative. In South Africa, you have the DA, that is a liberal party. So that's all really relative. But it will still be interesting to see, because Israel has also sent what it could in terms of its best performing team. It may be best in the eyes of other demagogues and other, Zionist apologists. Whether it will stand up to the basic tenets of the Geneva Convention and the international laws on genocide, actually arguing the case, that really remains to be seen.
Prof, I've got one final question to
Yes.
get through to you. The moral high ground of South Africa today, I think, and we started the show, of course, with this very same, conversation. Today really showed South Africa's strength on the world stage, didn't it? And earlier on, I had two guests, and they said that we may be punished, whether it's through AGOA or whether it's through other forums. But South Africa stood its ground today. That speaks a lot, doesn't it, of the moral high ground. No matter what the challenges are in this country, they've put their hands up at a time where not even the West put their hand up, and they've done so with conviction.
Well, actually, we've put them in a bit of a pickle, in a difficult spot, because they would have loved to have just, give South Africa this massive slip on the wrist or a kick under the butt.
Yes.
They would have loved to have done this. The problem is that unlike the International Criminal Court, that is a court between signatories, the International Court of Justice is this cherry on top of the international legal system to which they've all signed on. I mean, each of the Security Council members, by the way, are entitled to appoint a judge onto the court. And the Chief Justice of the court is an American citizen nominated by the United States. So, man, the court represents a respectability. And so, and South Africa to have taken them on their own terrain, this is a hard one for them to swallow. So they would have to bury or be slow in how they're going to punish South Africa. It's not going to be swift, but they're going to try to get back in South Africa. South Africa had calculated all of this, and we went ahead and we gave it to them as good as they'll ever get it.
Prof, shukran so much for joining us,
pleasure.
Prof. Your wisdom and your ability to break down everything is highly appreciated. And we say jazakallah to you for coming. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. That's Professor Farid Essack, of course, board member for the Africa for Palestine organization. But of course, he also serves as a lecturer at the University of Johannesburg. That's all we have for you here from South Africa at The Hague. Tomorrow, to join us again as we bring you an entire day's coverage of what will, of course, be happening down at The Hague from 11 to 2, of course, Israel's arguments. But, of course, we will be having pre- and post-analysis with regards to that. From myself, Fahraaz Patel, and the rest of the team at the Johannesburg studio, we say jazakallah to you, the viewer, for staying with us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.